Hi there, my name is Will, and I'm going to walk you through how you can go from dev to prod with Kestra. As your Kestra operation scales and you have multiple people creating workflows, it can get difficult to manage all of those different workflows and getting them set up in production correctly. That's why I'm going to walk you through a number of system workflows that will help you automate this process and get your production environment set up effortlessly. Let's jump into a few examples. Now, first things first is we're going to need to be able to put some of our flows into GitHub for this example. Now, if you're working locally on your machine, maybe this is just on your local machine in localhost, you're going to want to be able to push your flows from Kestra to your Git repository. Now, that's where the Git push flows plugin comes in pretty handy, and the push namespace files comes in handy. This allows you to push both your flows and namespaces, but you can sort of configure them separately because you might only want your flows and not your files and vice versa. So this is really helpful. We have a whole video dedicated to both of these plugins, so if you're interested to learn exactly how to set these up, I'd recommend checking that out. With that in mind, I also have this separate task here at the bottom here called Create PR. So maybe you've built your workflows, you're happy they work, and it's time to get it into production running on your prod server. Now, this will automatically create a pull request from develop to main, and then you can have someone in your team review it. Maybe you've got branch protection set up so you can't push to main anyway, but it's generally good practice to use a pull request in this scenario. So what you can have here is you can have your flows automatically pushed to your develop branch or a branch of your choice. Depends on how you have your repository set up. Same for your namespace files. And then you can create a PR off of that as well, completely automated. And if you want, you can have this schedule to run daily, or you can do this whenever it makes sense for you. Now, let's make a repository here that will allow us to be able to push our flows to GitHub. I am going to make sure we've got a README file so that we have a branch already existing. Otherwise, it won't be able to pull requests because there won't actually be a main branch to merge into. So with that in mind, it will set main as our default branch. So when I create this repository, we will already have a branch. Perfect. Now, it's worth noting, I already have a GitHub access token set up that will allow me to authenticate with GitHub. If you don't have this done already, make sure to do so. So now what I can do is I can run our workflow here that will push our flows, namespace files, as well as create a pull request between our develop and main branch, and then we can have a look at that in a second. Now that I'm executing this, we can see that it's going to successfully push those changes and it's going to create that PR. And now, as you can see here, all of a sudden, I now have a develop branch. This develop branch does have our flows in it. I can see all of the different flows that I've been using in my Kestra instance, which is really handy. I did actually specify in here for it to take them from company.team and then put them in the company.engineering namespace. So maybe you just put random namespaces on your local instance, but this workflow allows you to automatically change that so that it's suitable for your production instance. And so, for example, if I was to go to this open source Spotlight one, we can see that the flow namespace is now company.engineering. Very handy. I can also see that I have a pull request. So here we can see that pull request has been automatically created, request to merge changes from develop into main. So that really helps just speed up the process here. And now someone might get a notification to say there's a pull request and they'll get automatically assigned potentially to review it, depending on the automations you have set up on your repository. Now we can merge this into main, but there's currently nothing to pull these changes to our production instance of Kestra. So let's now have a look at that and how we can get that configured. There are two ways we can go about getting our flows and namespace files into our production instance of Kestra. One option is by using the SyncFlows and sync namespace files tasks, similar to those ones we just used to push our stuff to GitHub, but we can do the opposite and sync them back to Kestra. So here you can see I can target the company.engineering namespace specifically, which is the one that we specified for GitHub, and I can include child namespaces within that too. Now all we need to do is get the URL of our repository, put that in here, and this should work. So now that is set up, this is going to now pull any flows that get moved into the main branch automatically to Kestra. And I can actually set this up to be a little bit more regularly. So now this is going to run once every minute. We can actually check that here and see that it's going to run again in 1 minute's time. So if we go back to flows, we can actually see there is no company.engineering namespace. So we can see that it's not working currently. Let's merge this pull request in and make sure that works. Now you might be wondering, is there anything I can do here to validate that these workflows are correct automatically? Now, yes, there are a couple things. Firstly, you can't save a flow inside of Kestra unless it is in the correct format. So that's one way you can validate it, that the push flows task won't be able to push the flows unless they are in a saved format. Now, that doesn't allow for logical errors, so you'd have to check that yourself separately or create a way of testing those workflows. But if you want to check that they're at least a valid format, then that's one way you can do it. Second approach, and we just did a video on this, so I'd recommend checking that out separately, is we have GitHub Actions available for Kestra, where you can either validate that your flow is correct, and you can also deploy. And we'll talk a bit more about how that's another way of deploying from your main branch. So with that in mind, let's have a look at that action and see that we could add it to this pull request. But in this scenario, we don't need to because we're using push flows that already validates it before it pushes. So this is a separate example that I have, and this is using the GitHub Actions that we have available on the marketplace. Anyone can use these. And first of all, it validates our flow and then it deploys our flow. So here I've got a broken flow inside of the broken change branch. Now, if I go here, I can create a pull request. And when I create this, it will automatically start trying to validate if the flow is correct. And it will not let me merge until this flow is in the correct format. This is really useful if you're not necessarily using Kestra to push your flows. Maybe you're developing them on your local machine, but this all works with the Kestra server command line interface. So you can then run this validate command locally as part of a pre-commit hook. And as we can see here, it failed the validate check. So this is really reassuring that we shouldn't merge this pull request because it's in the incorrect format. But as you saw, that's because I edited it on GitHub. So if you're going to only be pushing these from Kestra, so using that previous flow of being able to push with push flows and be reassured that that won't push anything that isn't in a valid format because Kestra does not let you save a workflow in an incorrect format, that's one way. Instead, if you're using maybe not Kestra to push your workflows, then adding a GitHub action to your pull request is really useful. Check out that separate video on how to get that configured and set that up with rule sets for your branches as well. Anyway, going back to the push flows example, we are pretty happy that this is in the correct format. So now if I merge this pull request in like so, I can see that this now, if I go to the code, we can see our main branch now has our flows in it. Brilliant. So now if I go to that system flow that we had, and I can go to that like so, I can see sync from namespaces here. And this is actually running every minute. So let's get rid of that disabled property. So now it will run, and we'll see that it's next going to run in exactly 50 seconds. So let's wait for that and see it run in action. So as we can see just now, the sync from Git flow has successfully run, and we can see that it was successfully triggered using that schedule trigger. So now we can see under the logs that it has cloned both of our flows and namespace files to Kestra. So let's have a look. So we can see here company.engineering now exists, and we can see that all of those workflows that we originally had in company.team are now here. So this automatically will pull our changes from our main branch once they're available. Really, really helpful. We could also set this up with a webhook rather than a schedule. We actually have a separate video on that. So if you check out the video dedicated to SyncFlows, we've got a whole flow on how to set that up with branch protection. So I'd recommend checking that out too. Now we talked about another approach of being able to deploy your workflows to your production instance of Kestra. So we talked about using the tasks inside of Kestra, but like this other example, we have a GitHub action for that too. And so here you can see inside of our GitHub action, we say that whenever something is pushed to the main branch or a pull request is made to the main branch, we want to not only validate, but we also want to deploy it to Kestra. And we can say we want to deploy the flows. Now, this is really handy if you want to be able to set this up as part of your CI/CD pipeline that maybe deploys other things as well, rather than using Kestra as the CI/CD pipeline in this scenario. Really helpful if you are already using GitHub, and we have similar sort of integrations with other key Git repositories like GitLab, for example, and Azure DevOps. So if you would rather do it this way, then you can do that too. Let's just take a step back and summarize what we've just achieved to being able to go from dev to prod seamlessly. To begin with, we are pushing our workflows to the develop branch here in Kestra using our system namespace. We've got this flow here called push to git that's using push flows and push namespace files to push those to our develop branch. And when it does so, we are automatically creating a pull request. And we can set that pull request up to automatically ask for reviewers and require multiple reviews before it is allowed to be merged. Another approach we could take is adding that validation from the GitHub action to our pull request to check that the flows are in the correct format. But we can be quite confident that they are in the correct format. One, because we're getting a human to review it, but two, because Kestra push flows will only push a flow that has been saved, which requires it to be in a valid format. Now, it might not be the most up-to-date version of a flow because if it has an error, it can't be saved, but we can be happy that we're not pushing any broken code to GitHub. Now, once we've done that and we've created our pull request for being able to manage this and we merge it into main, there are two ways that we can then get that into our production instance. That first method is using that SyncFlows and sync namespace files task. As you can see here, this is now looking for a specific namespace and it's going to sync that directly to our Kestra instance. This is really useful because it means that that Kestra instance that's already running, because it's running your workflows, can also be pulling those flows from GitHub regularly. This takes one extra step out of the process that you haven't got to rely on another CI/CD platform to pull them. If Kestra is running, Kestra is going to pull those changes from your repository rather than relying on a separate service. And you can set this up with either a schedule or a webhook to automate when this happens. However, you might prefer to only pull those changes once a day to make sure that you're not getting too many different changes happening at the same time. It depends on how often your main branch gets populated. The other approach you can take is using the GitHub action that we have provided called the deploy action. If you want to be able to deploy it when commits are made to your main branch, this is all really useful if you want to use this as part of an existing GitHub action that you have available that's doing other things. And just to remind you, we have 5 dedicated videos here to help you with those push flows and sync flows tasks, as well as the GitHub actions as well. So if you're looking to set up one of those in particular, then I definitely recommend checking out these videos. Hopefully you found that useful and you're going to improve your dev to prod setup inside of Kestra to help seamlessly automate the process of going to production. Let us know in the comments below how you're using Kestra to go from dev to prod and how we can help support you in the future. Make sure to join our Slack community where you can discuss with us further, and make sure to give us a star on GitHub.